Thank you so much to everyone for joining us this Friday morning. We appreciate your time and your commitment. My name is Stephanie Chang. I'm the state representative from House District 6, and I want to thank you for signing the Stand Strong, Respect Michigan Recommitment Pledge. Some of you may have signed the pledge that we together did in December 2015 with Welcoming Michigan on Hate. We relaunched a recommitment pledge in November 2016, shortly after the election. And really the whole idea of these pledges has been to show that elected officials in Michigan are committed to combating hate and setting a standard of respect for all of Michigan's diverse communities. So, you know, it's so important for all of us to stand against hate. Obviously, the pledge is one way to do that and to really publicly show our communities that we stand against hate and discrimination and affirm that Michigan should be a welcoming state for all. But it's also a starting point for continuing the conversation about ways that we can address incidents when they arise in our own communities, and also to try to promote policies and ideas and events and other types of things that we can do as elected officials to really continue again to stand against hate and to really promote a welcoming Michigan. So it's been a great partnership with Take on Hate, with Welcoming Michigan, and this time around with Mothering Justice. And we've got a great call for you today with a number of resources. I think that we all know that the number of hate incidents has been on the rise since November 8th, and including in Michigan. So it really is going to take all of us working together and really, finding ways that we can build on the resources that Nadia and Christine and everyone else will share on the call today to show residents that we are going to fight for them. So thank you, Christine, so much for organizing the call, and I'm going to hand it over to Nadia.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Nadia Tonova. I'm the director of the National Network for Arab American Communities, which is an institution of access based here in Dearborn, Michigan. And we lead a project called our Campaign to Take on Hate. And what the Campaign to Take on Hate to challenge bigotry and discrimination that are facing Arab and Muslim Americans, and really does that through an intersectional lens so that we're standing against hate of all communities and really working to create the type of world that we want to live in, where people can feel free to live without being targeted, no matter their race, ethnicity, religion, or any other factor. And so we utilize different tools to be able to do this type of work. We do a lot of on-the-ground organizing and education events. Everything that we do is really tied to the grassroots, and so it's meeting people where they're at in their communities. But we also do some policy advocacy work. We do a lot of online organizing, social media work and creative use of media. We use a lot of arts and culture in our work, and we provide safe spaces and healing spaces for the community to be able to come together and talk and learn about issues collectively, and then be able to explore how these issues are impacting different communities of color and how people might be able to then come together and collectively, again, help to push back against hate and discrimination and create the type of society that they want to live in. So as elected officials, there are a number of ways that you could partner with us or bring us to your communities to be able to either address problems if you are having any issues in your community, or to be proactive and make sure that those problems don't start to happen. And so, I want to throw out a couple of ideas for you, and then I'm more than willing to take questions and hear your thoughts as well. One of the things that we have done is pass some local resolutions that within the city council, or even in Wayne County, they passed a resolution that's saying, we stand against hate, and our communities are going to be hate-free zones. And you'll see on the bottom of this slide here is actually a picture of the Detroit City Council. They were the first to pass the local resolution Numerous cities across Michigan have done that, including the city of Dearborn, the city of Taylor, the city of East Lansing. Like I mentioned, Wayne County has done that at the commission level as well. And so we'd love to work with you on a local resolution. Another great thing that we have found to be really successful are community conversations. These can be done in a couple of different ways. We often will go in and facilitate community conversations and pick a topic. We have done, a lot around race right after the elections. We had a large community conversation around healing after the election and what kind of, how we're going to deal with hate crimes and what kind of community that we want to be. These can be really impactful and powerful. We also have toolkits that enable people to have very small community conversations in their own home with their family or their friends. And that certainly is something that we can share with you, because it's a great way to get people just to get talking about the issues and start deciding on some smaller actions that they want to take. We have also done a lot of work with schools. There's been both colleges and high schools that we have gone into, and we can do basic presentations. These can include cultural competency around Arab and Muslim Americans. The great thing about this program being part of Access is that the Arab American National Museum is also an institution of Access, and so we have brought staff from the museum to do cultural competency presentations, and followed by creating that conversation and hearing student stories and giving them a platform to speak and share their own stories and talk about the environment that they want to create on campus and how they can support all different communities within their school. And so that's certainly something that we can work with you to do. Stories, we find, are an incredibly powerful way for people to speak out and for you to better understand what's happening in the community. Sometimes what happens is that hate incidents are occurring that do not rise to the level of a hate crime. So an example of this might be someone goes to the grocery store and someone yells, something, really discriminatory to them in the parking lot. This is a real-life example. This has happened in southeastern Michigan. The person is, obviously traumatized from that and very upset by it, but a crime has not occurred. They're not reporting that to the authorities in any way. But stories can be, again, an empowering way for them to process what is happening and then get to the point of taking action, and for you to hear those and to be able to better understand what's happening in your community, and then moving from the stories to action, to that collective action and healing. And so we have a lot of mechanisms to collect stories, and we're happy to come into your community and do that. And then the last thing I will say is, invite us to speak at your events. Again, we can really talk about very well the experience of Arab and Muslim Americans, but we can also talk about addressing hate crimes, addressing bias, about some of the structural things that have been put in place over the years that are now impacting our communities in this way. And we often partner with different, whether it's cities or elected officials, but also different community groups and nonprofit organizations like everyone here on the phone and many others to do joint events, and again, really be able to bring those type of conversations to the community. You can learn more on our website, which is takeonhate.org, and we're always available for questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nadia. We appreciate that. This is Christine Sauve at Welcoming Michigan. I'm going to pick up where Nadia left off. And I noticed we had a few questions coming in. I'm going to ask if folks you can continue to add those, but we'll get to Q&A at the end, just in case your question gets answered through the course of the presentation. So thank you all for joining us today. I know we ask a lot of our cities and elected leaders, but we need you more than ever to ensure protections remain strong in our communities, so thanks for taking the time. So just for those who aren't familiar, Welcoming Michigan is an immigrant integration initiative of the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center. And we focus on building communities that are welcoming and inclusive for all residents, including immigrants and refugees. So we work with both community-based organizations and local governments to ensure that newcomers are fully included and able to integrate socially, culturally, and economically. We hold film screenings and discussions. We offer training on immigration and welcoming topics. And we encourage folks to visibly show their support to help create a welcoming climate through buttons and posters. We love the One Human Family signs that have come out of Washtenaw County. We have more ideas like that in our post-election resources, and there was a link to that later in these slides. So I just want to talk a little bit about what it means to be a welcoming community. So a welcoming community builds relationships and fosters mutual respect among U.S.-born and foreign-born residents. And you would want to see collaboration across sectors with the goal of helping newcomers fully participate and contribute, again, to the social, cultural, and economic fabric of the community. And welcoming communities support their most vulnerable residents. So in this political moment, that certainly includes immigrants, refugees, religious minorities, LGBT residents, African American residents, just to name a few. So Nadia and Stephanie both talked a little bit about some of the bias that we have been seeing, and we focused on that a lot in our last call. But for anyone who wasn't on that call, I would just mention to keep reporting those incidents to both local police where it is safe to do so and Michigan Department of Civil Rights. In the month following the election, there were 65 bias incidents reported to MDCR, and their average is usually 5 to 10 per year. So that's a significant increase. And of those 65, 36 were at K through 12 schools or colleges and universities. So that kind of indicates a special place of concern. So as I mentioned, we work with local governments, and that includes Michigan's 13 now welcoming cities and counties. These are all communities who've joined Welcoming America's National Welcoming Cities and Counties Network. And they've made a long-term commitment to ensuring that their community is immigrant friendly. And this can be done through a host of different measures. You can see some of the topic areas laid out here on the slide. And that can include building partnership with immigrant leaders, supporting naturalization efforts, expanding language access or anti-profiling policies, and with the overall goal to be improving quality of life, again, not just for immigrants, but for all residents, and really by investing in more inclusive policies and practices. So those 13 municipalities, I'll just name them. I know we have some folks from these communities on the call. Detroit, Hamtramck, Macomb County, Sterling Heights, Clinton Township, West Bloomfield Township, Grand Rapids, Battle Creek, Kalamazoo County, Lansing, East Lansing, Meridian Township, and the newest on the block is Ann Arbor. If you are not on that list, we encourage your local city, township, or government leaders to join. We're happy to present locally to mayors, councils, and commissions about the program and can connect you with Welcoming America. So Welcoming Cities, as I mentioned, work on a lot of different initiatives, and here are some examples. Planning to create an inclusive environment, there's some example plans listed there. Enacting new policies and practices, we're going to talk a lot about that today because in this moment folks have expressed a lot of interest in strengthening protective policies for immigrants, and these can include investing in language access, non-solicitation status, not agreeing to a 287G request, non-compliance with detainer requests. These are some specific policies we'll get into a little bit more, so if you have questions on those, just make a note of it. We'll come back to those. Communicating right now in this moment is so important. So messages of inclusion, please utilize any opportunity where you're communicating with residents, whether it's via Facebook or in a public speech. And as Nadia highlighted, stories are so much more persuasive than facts. And so tell the stories of your residents. And if you don't know the stories of your residents and what they might be experiencing, I would encourage you to start by building relationships with immigrant and ethnic community leaders. I will add here that there are no changes yet to the refugee resettlement program, so if anyone's in Kalamazoo, Battle Creek, Grand Rapids, Lansing, Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti, or the Tri-County area of Metro Detroit, I especially encourage you to reach out to your local resettlement agencies. There is a long list of, there's about 6 agencies that work in those places, so USCRI, Samaritas, Bethany Christian Services, Catholic Charities of Southeast Michigan, St. Vincent Catholic Charities, and Jewish Family Services. So if you're not connected, we can help make those connections, or you can find their contacts online. And then lastly, building community. So public engagement activities to really start to forge those bonds between longtime residents and newcomers are going to continue to be important. I have a long list here of sample community building activities. This is more for your reference that you can check out later. But one way to help counter the bias that we have seen increasing is by promoting and creating opportunities for social contact, so getting people together. So supporting these events in your community, whether it's a potluck, a service day, cleanup, or cultural event, all of these are great opportunities for getting folks working together side by side. So you can reference this list later. You'll have these slides in your handouts. I want to talk, of course, about sanctuary cities because we've had a lot of questions on this topic. So there is no strict legal meaning or definition. There's a wide variance in policies that may or may not trigger a sanctuary designation. So for example, non-solicitation of immigration status or non-compliance with ICE detainer requests. Those may be considered sanctuary under some cases, under some reviews, but not always. So that part remains to be seen what the bar will be if there is any review coming by the federal government. Sanctuary cities are not the same as welcoming cities. There's some overlap, but welcoming cities, I would say, take a holistic view of different strategies, whereas typically the term sanctuary refers to places with one or more policies limiting cooperation with immigration enforcement. So there's kind of a specific focus there. A subset of welcoming cities, I would say, may be considered sanctuary depending on the bar or definition that's applied. For us, it's less important whether you embrace the label of sanctuary city or welcoming city, and we understand that there are some political realities for choosing one or the other. But what's more important is the underlying relationships and policies to keep people safe. So again, we have some specific policy ideas about that in the handout from ILRC about protecting immigrants, and we'll talk about a few today. But I would encourage you to think more broadly about what sanctuary can mean. You know, for someone to truly feel safe in their community, they'd be looking for increased trust with law enforcement, access to services, affordable and fair housing, protection from bias and hate crimes, and this is much of the work that a welcoming city focuses on in a long-term holistic view. I will note that there may be some potential funding restrictions placed on sanctuary cities. We don't know what that would look like just yet. There's been a lot of speculation, different folks conjecturing what percentage that would be. So stay tuned, but those restrictions would likely occur in places where there is, again, specifically limited cooperation with ICE or immigration enforcement. So this link that's on the bottom of my slide, I don't know if it made it onto your slides, I apologize, but I wanted to just add that if you're interested, there will be a members-only webinar for Welcoming America members on sanctuary cities on Tuesday, and a policy link webinar on January 30th. So the policy link one would be open to anyone, and you'll have this, I can send you that link if you can't find it online. And then finally, I will just add, we've given you some additional resources here so that you have a lot in your toolbox. We've given you a couple handouts. A couple of the links here also have multiple resources there. So in the post-election welcoming page, we have a lot talking about bias, things about education in the schools, some things for general recommendations for residents. The police and communities is a great resource with a lot in there. If you are ready to invest in language access, lep.gov has a lot of information for you. MERC right now has a Google Doc with some evolving resources there on a variety of different topics. And then finally, I wanted to highlight the map of local entanglement with ICE that's done by county. So ILRC, the Immigration Legal Resource Center, reviewed cooperation with ICE by county, and you can see how they rated Michigan County. So we have two bright spots in the state. That's Washtenaw County and, surprisingly, Leelanau County. You can check that out online and see how your county measures up on a couple different factors that they looked at. And on this topic, one thing they looked at was non-compliance with detainer requests. I think Ruby or Juan might touch on that a little bit more, but MERC and ACLU issued a letter for sheriffs and a toolkit for law enforcement on this. The letter with the link to the toolkit is in your handouts as well. So we expect a lot of bad news possibly coming in the first 100 days. We don't know exactly. Might be increased deportations, workplace raids, not sure. But you can stay up to date with the emerging policy changes through MERC. And I'll turn it over to Ruby now, who can give you a better sense of some of those immigration realities.
Great. Thank you, Christine, and thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. So I've been asked to talk. I'm Ruby Robinson. I'm a supervising attorney with the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center, and I've been asked to talk about what are we likely to see over the next 100 days, possibly over the next 4 years, especially as it relates to an increased enforcement climate. And the main thing to take away right now is no one really knows what is going to happen. There have been conflicting things that the President-elect and members in Congress have said about immigration enforcement over the next 4 years. So I want to provide at least some general context about what we've seen already over the past 4, 8, and 16 years, and a little bit more context about, well, what this possibly could mean moving forward. So just to kind of provide a basis of where we've been, during the administration, or during the Bush administration, about 2 million people were removed from the United States. During the Obama administration, about 2.7 million people have been removed. So the myth or the belief that the Obama administration has been light on deportation, it does not really hold up. What the Obama administration has done, though, has focused on certain priorities, and based on what the president-elect has indicated, likely those priorities are going to continue. So violent criminals, repeat immigration violators, people associated with gangs, people who have drug convictions, those types of individuals are likely going to be targeted for immigration enforcement moving forward. Hopefully, in people who are lower priority, people who don't have violent or felony convictions, people who don't have misdemeanor convictions, ideally we would like for that to continue, that they are not a priority for removal. There is only a limited number of people who can actually be removed from the United States, not in terms of like any legislative or statutory basis for that, but just in terms of manpower and the resources that the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice have in order to process these, these removals. So just so everyone is aware, there are about 300 immigration judges in the United States and 520,000 people already in immigration proceedings and deportation proceedings. So it takes a long time to go through that process. And so adding millions of more people to that process will not necessarily speed up the removal for millions of people who are here without status right now. During the campaign, the president-elect has indicated that he was going to terminate the Deferred Action Program for children who enter the United States before the age of 16, also known as DACA. After the election, it seems that he has wavered on this, and in his interview in Time magazine, he said, we're going to work something out for, the DACA kids. They got brought here at a very young age. They've worked here. They've gone to school. Some were very good students. Some have wonderful jobs, and they're in a never land because they don't know what's going to happen. Paul Ryan yesterday also, the Speaker of the House, also indicated that he would like to work out some type of solution for the DACA kids, about 707 to 750,000 of them in the United States. But, what that's going to be, we don't really know. There has been a memo that was created by the Center for Immigration Studies, which is a think tank that has provided a lot of ideas to the Trump administration, and is likely a lot of its ideas are being considered by people in their transition team who are working in regard to the Department of Homeland Security. And so some of these ideas range from expanding removal authority in various areas of the law, increasing raids, expanding E-Verify, repealing memos and protections for vulnerable populations. And so that's some of the things that are being discussed, but honestly we don't know what is going to be happening moving forward. There has been, Christine mentioned a moment ago about programs to, in regard to local counties and governments cooperating in terms of immigration enforcement activities, especially in regard to honoring detainers. A detainer is a request by Immigration Customs Enforcement to hold on to an individual after they are permitted to leave the county jail or the city jail for maybe they were arrested for driving without a license, or maybe some other minor infraction. They paid their bond and they're permitted to go. What had been happening and happens in many counties around the country is that ICE will issue a detainer saying, please hold on to this person for 48 hours so we can determine if we want to pick that person up and send him or her to immigration court. Many counties around the country have pushed back and said that they are not going to honor these detainers. That is one aspect of a sanctuary city policy, or a policy that a local municipality can take on. I know that several counties have actually specifically stepped back because they have been sued by entities like the ACLU because it is depriving persons who are essentially permitted to leave from doing so. And actually, just from an economic perspective, counties do not get reimbursed for the cost of detaining people at ICE's request. So while ICE and potentially the administration says it's going to withhold funds, they are also forcing counties and local governments to expend resources to detain folks indefinitely or potentially 2 or 3 days longer than they were planning on doing so. In terms of other immigration realities and what we can expect moving forward, I can't imagine absent a huge influx of money to the Department of Homeland Security, I can't see a giant deportation force coming into being, just given the nature of our current budget nationally and the plan to hopefully not expand federal spending too much. One thing that local counties and municipalities and governments can do, and Christine mentioned earlier, is really expanding opportunities for people to feel safe in their communities and letting them know what their rights are, talking about providing opportunities to have Know Your Rights sessions, expanding trust with the police, providing other types of access to services, in kind of that welcoming environment that Christine was discussing earlier. There was a change yesterday in regard to Cubans. So the United States has had very special relationship with people from Cuba, and last night part of that relationship has changed as a result of the normalizing of relationship between the United States and Cuba. So for example, previously any Cuban who entered the United States was automatically paroled in, and within a year, absent certain criminal convictions or other things, that person would be eligible for a green card. It looks like that policy, known as wet foot, dry foot, is now going to be retracted, and so Cubans are going to be treated like any other non-citizen entering the United States or trying to enter the United States in terms of how the government is going to be working with them. I'm happy to answer immigration-related questions toward the end of this. I want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to speak and people have opportunities to ask whatever questions they have. In terms of banning people based on ethnicity or religion, I think that's going to be a very difficult thing to pass constitutional muster. And when Marine General John Kelly, who has been nominated to be the Department of Homeland Security Secretary the other day, was at his confirmation hearing, he said, "I don't agree with registering people based on their ethnicity or religion." So religious tests, banning Muslims, I don't expect that to happen. And if it is attempted, I think that it would fail if it were challenged, or when it is challenged. So I think this is probably what I want to finish talking about right now. We'll pass this along to Juan, who I think is up next, and I am happy to talk and answer questions toward the end.
Hi, this is Juan Caballero from the ACLU of Michigan. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm the new legal fellow, and I was asked to also sort of, in addition to everyone else, talk a little bit about what local communities can also do as far as, helping your immigrant constituents and immigrant communities and new American communities sort of feel a part of it. So as far as my slides, I included 2 slides. The first one is a map of basically what constitutes a reasonable distance of the border for the purposes of border patrolling. And this is important because what this is effectively a map of everywhere where Border Patrol, one of the largest law enforcement agencies in the country, has a expanded power to detain and search an individual and question individuals. Basically, this is a relaxing of the Fourth Amendment for everyone who is found in this region. These maps are part of a recent lawsuit that we filed trying to increase transparency as far as these policing tactics. In the first map, you can see it for the whole country. It's unfortunately the best map I could find, so but it's still a little blurry, so I included a second map, which is Michigan specific. And in both maps, what you'll see is that the entirety of the state of Michigan is highlighted. It looks a lot like the ILRC map that was shown earlier. And basically what this means is that in the entirety of the state of Michigan is treated like the border. It's treated as if, you know, anyone driving around, anyone going about their business can be stopped and detained and questioned and searched with very little to no individualized suspicion, allowing for great invasions of privacy. And I guess I want to start with that because one of the things that we found in this litigation is namely that one of the only real checks on Border Patrol's authority and policing power in the state of Michigan is just their manpower. While it is the biggest law enforcement agency in the country, they don't necessarily mobilize and have a large presence throughout the entirety of the state. Now, that's based on like the few documents that have been released to us, and we're working on getting a better picture of them. But that's one of the things that we're seeing. And so one of the things that appears to be a strategy is to increase local cooperation, or at least rely heavily on local police and local law enforcement in Border Patrol's policing efforts. What we've seen so far is that about 60% of individuals who are processed by Border Patrol, 60% of those stops and processings are started by local law enforcement agents. So this local federal entanglement when it comes to immigration enforcement is still a very real problem throughout much of Michigan, and something that we're really interested in trying to curtail. Especially since while everyone has done a really good job highlighting the fact that, you know, the Trump administration is largely inscrutable and we don't know necessarily what is going to happen going forward, it appears that one of the emerging strategies, and this is entirely new, but it's to expand existing law enforcement power by increasing local federal coordination of resources in law enforcement. So when it comes to just general proposals and policies that the ACLU is encouraging different communities to adopt and pursue, I've narrowed it down to a few, and I would talk one, and this is related to the map, is invest in translation services for law enforcement and local communities and local governments generally, but especially for law enforcement. One of the big things that seems to be emerging is that, that from the evidence we found, is that law enforcement is calling ICE under the pretense of seeking language services. So ICE and Border Patrol, under the pretense of seeking language services, they claim that if they encounter someone who speaks a different language, or even if it's Spanish, that they don't have anyone or any ability to communicate with that, and they have to basically outsource it to ICE. And that is one of the problematic policies that effectively leads to the 60% statistic that I mentioned earlier. So what we're trying to do is effectively stop that line of communication by getting these law enforcement to not call ICE, but call an actual company that specializes in translation services, so that those local police can continue to do their job without creating these tangential problems. One of the other things that we were monitoring, and this is more of a concern, we haven't necessarily seen an uptick in this yet, but is that the Trump administration has promised these immigration task forces. We're not entirely sure what that means, but one thing that we fear is that it will likely mean increased workplace and home raids. These can be incredibly problematic, incredibly unconstitutional in practice. And one of the things that we are going to try to encourage local police and local communities to do is to protect the local police brand. A lot of Michigan communities have done a really good job of advocating and pushing for community-based policing, especially in immigrant communities, and building up that trust. And what happens often with these raids is that ICE or ICE officials or Border Patrol will knock and improperly announce their presence. They will often just knock and claim to be policia and not properly indicate that they are immigration officials. We've seen this in a number of other states and a number of home raids. We haven't seen it in Michigan yet, but it is something that we are going to continue to police, and we hope that local communities that have invested a lot in developing community relations will also make sure that ICE isn't improperly identifying themselves with the local law enforcement, so that they don't lose what credit they've built up with that community through those positive programs. We talked a little bit about not attempting to not collect immigration information where it's not necessary. As I believe Christine mentioned, it's unclear what exactly a sanctuary city is. There's no legal definition. It's unclear what is meant when Donald Trump uses it to target different communities. Some people do consider this to be part of sanctuary policies. Others don't. I think it's probably one of those safer policies that's likely to fall outside of it. But with everything else, it's a large unknown. Another additional policy that individuals can adopt is, where possible, to allow for a greater use of different forms of ID, and not limiting ID specifically to government issued or local government issued. A lot of immigrant communities may have access to either passports or non-government IDs that, if appropriate, might be able to be used in lieu of a Michigan driver's license or some other type of document. And one of the final sort of strategies that we're trying to monitor and put forward is to talk to local law enforcement, both police and any sort of local attorneys, city attorneys, about certifying U visas and T visas. These two visas are resources created by the federal government for victims of crimes, and effectively they're available to anyone who helps and assists law enforcement in the prosecution of certain qualifying offenses. These tend to be, for T visas, trafficking offenses. For U visas, it's a little broader. It often includes domestic violence offenses. Some have argued that it also includes labor offenses. So these are very broad categories of resources that were created. Unfortunately, one of the bottlenecks in the U and T visa application process is that it requires some law enforcement agency, either a local judge, someone in the police department, or someone from the local DA's office to certify the application before submission. And if these agencies and offices don't have appropriate policies, or if they're not informed about the availability of these resources, this is something that often goes unused and underutilized. And we want to make sure that someone who is qualified for these visas is able to basically actually go forward with their application. So we would like for anyone who has an avenue of communicating with local police departments or local DA's offices to advocate for the adoption of positive policies in this regard, and possibly training the different officials on the availability of these federal resources. And so those are some of the proposals that we're putting forth. In addition to all of this, I want to mention that while we don't necessarily have proposals going forward, we are monitoring sort of the legal developments with regards to sanctuary cities. The Trump administration has promised to really target them, and we're not entirely sure what that means. There are a number of problems and possible legal arguments to be made with response to any sort of attack on sanctuary cities. I realize that might not necessarily put many people at ease, but it's not a done deal, and we are very closely monitoring the situation. In addition to that, I would also mention that we are closely monitoring any efforts to either recreate NCRs or a Muslim registry. While Trump has backed away from his comments about banning all Muslims, and we've seen from the confirmation hearings that it might not be a clear picture, we are concerned that something like the NCRs program might be recreated Fortunately, President Obama dismantled the NCERS program in late December. So any attempts to recreate it will basically have to start from scratch. But you know, nothing is beyond the Trump administration, and that is something that we're looking and monitoring very closely, and we're preparing to basically fight our protective fight on. In addition to all of this, I want to make sure that everyone is aware that the ACLU of Michigan is holding a lawyer summit on February 4th, and we're trying to invite as many people who want to attend as possible. Currently, registration is still open, but it is quickly filling up, and we might have to put a 400-person cap on it. But again, the date is February 4th. It's going to be held at the University of Michigan, and we're going to have our new legal director, the new national ACLU legal director, David Cole, in attendance, as well as Justice Bridget McCormick from the Michigan Supreme Court. So everyone who's interested in attending, everyone who's interested in having a more active role with the ACLU, or just coming to learn more, please feel free to register and come join us. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Juan, so much for all that information. So we've left a lot of time for questions. So I'm going to start on our questions that we've already received. So feel free to enter your questions into the box there. Nadia, I'm wondering if perhaps you could address a few questions from one of our participants. Can you give examples of how Take on Hate uses arts to push back against hate?
I have a couple of examples of this. One is actually coming up. So on January 21st here in Dearborn at the Arab American National Museum, there is going to be a concert with several different local artists, and the event is around solidarity, art, and love, and so kind of coming together and you know, using music to have like a peaceful and healing message, and for people to be able to just come together at that time. We have also incorporated arts into our events. So, for example, we have used things like film and show a film that's relevant to a topic and have a discussion. We've also done a series here called our Race and Identity series, where we actually, it was a 6-part series over 6 months that taught people about issues of, you know, racism 101, colorism, microaggressions, you know, these really difficult topics, and we made the material more approachable by incorporating arts into the curriculum as well. And so people would kind of come, they would start off with a small lecture on the topic, then they would do a group activity, then we would have an artist come up, whether it was a music performance or spoken word or poetry, and kind of, you know, relating to that topic, but again, give people that reflection through the art space, and then go back, you know, to a small lecture and discussion on that topic. And it just, from the feedback that we got from the participants, it made it much more approachable and enjoyable rather than kind of sitting through a really heavy lecture on one of these topics, help people to process the information along the way. And so those are kind of 2 different ways that we have been able to use the arts in our work.
Great, thank you so much. A few other questions here. To Ruby, do you know of any sanctuary options or policies for county jails that are also immigration detention centers? I guess Ruby or Juan, if you could answer that.
So my first thought would be actually, if the county is otherwise a welcoming county, or it's a city that otherwise has welcoming aspects to it, so providing access to services in multiple languages, I know that's something that often is missing in detention centers. So that would definitely be something that I would encourage and push for in terms of people who are held in immigration detention. Perhaps, Juan, you have other ideas, but that's the first thing that came to mind.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, limiting any sort of contracts with ICE as far as increased bed capacity or continuing those contracts when they're up for renewal. But I realize that can be a really big uphill push politically. So other than that, yeah, I would echo your sentiments by just increasing resources to individuals who find themselves in those detention centers.
And just so folks are aware, could Ruby or Juan, can you answer about how many folks are actually physically detained at any moment versus folks that are released but are still in deportation proceedings?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We've actually tried to get this number from the Michigan Immigration and Customs Enforcement Office multiple times, but they have always rebuffed our requests because they say essentially it changes all the time and they can only give us a snapshot at any given time. In Michigan, it's important to know that there are 4 main places, 4 county jails where immigrants can be detained right now, or where at least ICE has contracts. They are in Port Huron in the St. Clair County Jail, in Monroe at the Monroe County Jail, in Battle Creek in the Calhoun County Jail, and up in Sault Ste. Marie in the Chippewa County Correctional Facility. And so there are people who are detained by ICE, and these are individuals mainly who have violent criminal backgrounds or people who are subject to mandatory detention, which is an immigration term for people who have committed certain types of crimes. So drug offenses is the major reason why someone would be subject to mandatory detention, meaning that person would not be able to be released on bond pending their actual hearing or trial in immigration court. Other individuals, non-violent, people who have non-violent backgrounds and who otherwise can demonstrate potentially a likelihood of success or have just the money to pay a bond to be released, and usually the minimum bond is $1,500, but it can go up, I've seen as high as $15,000 or even higher in immigration court. They are released on what's known as an alternative to detention, ATD, and that can mean one of many things, that they are simply released and are told to show up at their court hearing. They might have to check in every year, every month, every week. In person in Detroit at the ICE office, they might have to do telephone monitoring, or they might be given a GPS anklet so that their movements can be tracked. So there are various ways that someone who is in immigration court proceedings but is not actually in detention. So not 520,000 people are in immigration detention at any given time.
Thanks, Ruby. Next question we'll shift gears a little bit. Are there any suggestions for reaching people who are not already predisposed to supporting inclusion? And I will say, and Nadia can chime in, I think we both kind of highlighted this, that storytelling is really the best way to reach people. And that may seem odd at first, but really what's behind that is a lot of brain research. And what we're finding is that folks who are already sort of ascribed to a certain worldview or beliefs or political outlook, once you have your mind made up, when you hear data that confirms it, it reinforces it, and when you hear data that contradicts it, it actually pushes you further into your initial position. So there's a few cases where sharing data on immigration has been shown to actually help change people's minds. This just came out of some research recently, and showing people specifically, I believe it was related to the facts that immigrants are less likely to be criminals than the native-born population. And there were 2 other elements that I'm forgetting right now, but I'd be happy to include a link to that research. But the moral of the story here is that telling a narrative around a real person's experience helps to change someone's mind more than sharing data on the whole. So what we have found is that creating an opportunity that involves another element, so whether it's, again, something with food or the arts or a film screening, something like that helps create an opportunity where people can start to meet on common footing. And then when you hear someone's story, it's much harder to contradict that real lived experience, and there's a personal element to it, and our brains actually grasp that more easily, and that helps counter some of the implicit bias that we already carry. Nadia, I don't know if you have anything to add to that topic about how to reach people who are not already predisposed to supporting inclusion.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. I agree with everything that you just said, and definitely kind of bringing in that other element of food or arts is a really great way. For me, I think the only thing I would add is, you want to look at ways to get people into a room and then have an event that is humanizing others, right? Whether it's through stories or just that interaction. I think that's the first way, because you're not, for example, someone who isn't interested in inclusion or learning more about immigrant rights, they're not going to come to a community discussion on one of those topics, right? That's just not where you're going to pull them in. But I think there's a lot of potential looking at even things like schools. All parents want to know who their kids are going to school with, or are more interested in getting engaged in schools. So can you think about a program, for parents to get to know one another at the schools? Or can you think about, really local neighborhood fun gathering at the neighborhood, a picnic or something, where, again, it's bringing people together. And it's something that folks who might not be interested in this kind of programming would go to, because there is a self-interest there. And then while they're there, they have that chance to interact and to hear some stories and to, actually meet people that are different from them and come into it that way. And so that would be the only thing I would add.
And just to add one more thing to that, I would say another strategy that's helpful is to some of those events, like a picnic or food-related event, will draw people, but another strategy is to go where people already are. So presenting to the Rotary Club or a church group, somewhere where folks are already accustomed to gathering and it's a comfortable space. That can be an easier way to reach people. I'm going to move to another question here for Ruby. Has any higher court ever ruled that honoring detainers is a violation of constitutional protections? And I believe the answer is yes.
Yeah, the answer is yes. There have two cases come to mind. There's a case out of Pennsylvania, Salazar versus Galarza versus somebody's last name who I'm not going to try to pronounce, but both cases are out of 2014. They're actually both ACLU cases, and the second one is out of Oregon in Clackamas County as well. And both those cases ruled, and Juan can provide further context, that indefinite detention can be a violation of someone's Fourth Amendment rights. And so there is precedent that detaining people essentially without a basis is a violation of their constitutional rights, and it should be stopped, or it can be stopped.
Yeah, so just to jump on that real quick, Ruby, I'm sure the ACLU is not the only organization that has brought these cases, but we have brought quite a few regarding detainers and unlawfully confining an individual. And rather than give a rundown, I would refer everyone to the ACLU website where we actually published a list of recent cases of U.S. citizens subject to unlawful immigration detainers. which does actually compile the variety of cases from actually a number of states sort of discussing this issue. Yeah, and yeah, so it's a long URL, so I would actually, it might be easier for everyone to just Google, ACLU, and the title of the document is Recent Cases of U.S. Citizens Subject to Unlawful Immigration Detainers.
Thank you. Another question for either Ruby or Juan. Would a ban on persons entering the country based on country of origin, not ethnicity per se, would that pass constitutional muster?
That is a great question. My gut says no, but I'm having a hard time connecting the dots right now in my mind. If that person were also a U.S. citizen, then absolutely, I think that would fail equal protection under our federal Constitution. But if it was a new law that said the United States will not accept people from a specific country and no U.S. citizen who are not U.S. citizens or permanent residents, I could potentially see that having some chance of surviving, but I think it would be very, very low because people who have not yet availed themselves of the protections of the Constitution, if they're outside the United States and don't otherwise have a connection to the United States, would not necessarily be protected. But it has been a few years since I've taken civil procedure, so I read constitutional law, so I would defer to people who practice more of that, and perhaps Juan has some guidance on that type of question.
I'm not holding myself as an expert either, but it's my understanding that the Equal Protection Clause does consider national origin to be a protected class, so any sort of policy that discriminates on individuals based on that would be subject to strict scrutiny, which means it would be a very difficult standard in order to justify any sort of policy for effectively discriminating against someone based on their national origin. I think it would be certainly a very different argument if they are a U.S. citizen versus if they're solely a citizen of the other country. But I do believe it'd be a tough fight in the courts. I would say though that as a caveat that with terrorism might be something that would be enough to justify such a policy. Additionally, our immigration laws have traditionally have placed quotas on individuals coming from certain countries, and that might be used to sort of defend any such policy as, it's no different than imposing a quota, or it's an extension of that type of policy. I don't know how that would fly in modern courts. That's just a brief lay of the land as far as what type of challenge such policy would face.
And actually just one quick follow-up to that, and it's important to know that the president alone has absolute control over the number of refugees who are entering the United States. So it is technically, per the 1980 Refugee Act, so it is technically within the president's discretion if he wishes to have 0 refugees enter the United States in a specific year, that could happen. So, a variation of this question could a ban on people from Syria coming to the United States, could that happen? Potentially, yes, if the president says we will not be accepting refugees from Syria.
Okay, thank you both for those answers. I'm going to go back to Nadia for a question about, can Take on Hate or Access make use of volunteers, including non-Muslims and non-Arabic speakers?
Yes, absolutely. Again, on the website is where folks can sign up to be volunteers, but we're always taking volunteers. You don't have to be Arab or Muslim or Arabic speaking, so we would love to have you.
Great, thank you. Let's see, next question here. Can you provide samples of some of the protective policies that we mentioned? So, for example, the preemptive policy that local law enforcement won't cooperate with 287G requests, etc. So some of those sample protective policies we mentioned, and I might just quickly go back to that. The preemptive non-cooperation with the 287G request. So just to clarify, the 287G program essentially kind of deputizes local officers to serve as immigration enforcement agents. So that would be one potential way that if the new administration was looking to increase the enforcement capacity, that is one approach that might be used. Currently, there's only about 32 agencies in the country that participate in 287G, and I do not think we have one in Michigan. So I actually haven't seen a sample preemptive statement or policy that says we will not cooperate if asked. But ILRC, the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, they have been doing a lot of work on some of these sample policies, so we can look for that. I just don't have it at hand. Some of the other policies here, though, the non-compliance policy for jails, Ruby or Juan, I don't know, do you guys have a sample policy that or sample language that sheriffs can use to take action on that?
I don't have any offhand, but I'm sure we could work together to provide one to you or with your municipality to put something together that would work out for you.
And some of these ideas here are things that we've been thinking, really post-election. So I think some of this will be emerging as some of the, new realities take shape. So, for example, I know in talking with ACLU, we talked about language access and investing in it. But to my knowledge, Juan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not aware of a policy or ordinance that has been put in place yet that says city and county employees won't contact ICE for translation. Have you seen a policy written like that yet, or is that something we can find elsewhere?
It's not something we've seen necessarily written. From our most recent communication with Grand Rapids Police, they claim to have that type of policy on the books, but they don't want to draw much attention to it because of the political climate. So it's one of those things where I'm sure some police departments outside of Grand Rapids have, hopefully adopted these policies, but I don't think there's much language floating around. But like Ruby said, we could try to throw something together if people are interested in that.
Okay. So if you're interested in that, feel free to follow up directly with Ruby or Juan. Let's see. Amending non-discrimination ordinances. I know that ACLU just helped us with that with Ypsilanti, and they're working on that currently right now. So that is definitely something that is doable. I'm going to go to another question here. Oh, wait, we already answered that one. So unless I'm missing any, does anyone else have a question that we haven't answered yet? Speak now or forever hold your peace.
I just want to add one thing to what Juan said earlier about the definition of where the border is in Michigan and why it's so important to get clarification on that. The major thing is ICE and CBP have authority delegated to them under the 1997 immigration law that said essentially they can institute what's known as an expedited removal order, that someone can be ordered deported from the United States without even going to immigration court. And generally this has to happen within a border region and within a certain amount of time of somebody entering the United States. So if the entire state of Michigan is deemed to be a border state, then technically anybody could be stopped, shortly detained, and issued a deportation order without going to an immigration judge, provided they meet certain circumstances. And those circumstances do change depending on kind of the enforcement priorities and memorandum of an administration. So that's why it is so important to know why the border is this way and if there's anything potentially that can be done to challenge it.
Great, thank you, Ruby. So I don't see any other questions coming in, just in case as people are percolating. I'm just going to point out that in your handouts you should see a copy of these slides, and there's two very useful toolkits from ILRC. One is Local Options for Protecting Immigrants, and one is called Searching for, and the Local Options has a lot of those example policies. It doesn't have the full text of a ordinance or resolution. They might be able to help craft something or might have something at their disposal, so you could follow up directly with ILRC if you're interested in that. And there's contact info at the back of their toolkits. Searching for Sanctuary is the guide where they have done a review of counties across the country, including Michigan, and they looked at, I think it's 7 different categories of potential cooperation with ICE and rated each county, so you can check that out. The letter to Michigan sheriffs from Merck and ACLU, and there's a link in, or the web address and link in the letter to the further guide about immigration and local law enforcement. The VERA Engaging Police and Immigrant Communities toolkit has lots of great ideas for community policing, and if you go to their website, and there's a link in the slides to that, there's wonderful examples from police departments across the country, so feel free to share that with your local law enforcement. And lastly, the slides from this webinar are also included in the handouts, minus the one link to the upcoming Policy Link webinar on Sanctuary Cities, January 30th. So we had allotted extra time to make sure we had answered everyone's questions. I don't see any other questions at this time, but if you do come up with something later on, feel free to reach out to one of our presenters. We have emails listed here. I want to thank everyone for participating and for making time for this, and feel free to follow up as you're exploring how to make your community as safe and protective as possible for all your residents. And as new policies or things emerge with the new administration, keep in touch with us, and we may need to do another webinar to see how communities can respond as things emerge. I'd like to thank all of our presenters for making time today. We really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and wisdom. And with that, I think we'll close the webinar unless there's any final thoughts. Oh, wait, one last question here. How many, is there any way to find out how many residents from a particular county are being deported? Juan or Ruby?
I am not aware of any way to measure that statistic. So people who have, because I think there's a lot that goes into it, how many people have been deported, how many people are in deportation proceedings. You can try to send a Freedom of Information Act request to ICE, but I think that it is likely to not be responded to because it's not a statistic that they likely track.
Yes, that's something that we don't have on hand, and I would echo Ruby's comment. Yeah.
So sorry that's not readily available. I know I think another of our attorneys, Anna, had tried to look into that as well with not too much success. So if we find a way later on, we'll let you know, but at this time it's difficult to get those numbers. Okay, well with that, I don't see any other questions. So thank you everyone for your time, and we appreciate your interest in addressing bias, protecting immigrants, and advancing welcoming in your community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.